Without objection, the chair will authorize to declare recess of the subcommittee at any time. I welcome everyone to today's hearing on H.R. 40 and the path to restorative justice. I'll now recognize myself for an opening statement. Today is Juneteenth, a day that commemorates the announcement of the abolition of slavery in Texas and more generally throughout the former Confederacy on June 19, 1865. The news of the Emancipation and Proclamation did not reach Texas for 2 years, and so it was not until 1865 that all enslaved people knew they were free, despite President Lincoln's emancipation announcement. Slavery was a crime against humanity, one whose impacts we as a society continue to grapple with today. This year also marks the 400th anniversary of the first African slaves being brought to America. Slavery was our nation's original sin. Our Constitution protected it, embodying it in various compromises that gave disproportionate power to slave states. For example, the 3/5 clause count a slave as 3/5 of a person for population counts. Of course, they weren't considered persons, but property. But that in turn gave disproportionate representation to slave states in the House of Representatives. The Constitution also created the Electoral College, a system of electing the President of the United States that gave slave states another avenue to exercise disproportionate influence over national affairs. It is only fitting then that we should hold a hearing today on H.R. 40, the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act. My colleague, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, who is in another hearing right now, she's here with us, thank you. A member of the subcommittee, is the current lead sponsor of this legislation, and I'm proud to be a co-sponsor with her, along with full committee chair, Jerry Nadler, also a longtime co-sponsor of this bill. But the greatest credit for H.R. 40 belongs to two individuals. First and foremost, Mr. John Conyers. Mr. Conyers is a former colleague and former chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, a great American and a great leader, one of my mentors. One of the reasons that I have introduced this resolution with him since 2007. He introduced it first 30 years ago, and he reintroduced it every Congress thereafter until his retirement. The second individual most responsible for H.R. 40 is sadly, but in reality, John Wilkes Booth. His assassination of President Abraham Lincoln led to Andrew Johnson becoming president. And President Johnson effectively rescinded the promise made by General William T. Sherman to former slaves that they would each be guaranteed 40 acres of land to make a living as a free person. A promise sometimes colloquially referred to as 40 acres and a mule. President Lincoln would have carried that out and had plans to do it. But because of that dastardly day and deed of April 12 of 1865, it didn't occur. Was it April 14 maybe? Anyway, H.R. 40 would create a commission to study the history of slavery in America, the role of the federal and state governments in supporting slavery and racial discrimination, other forms of discrimination against the descendants of slaves, and the lingering consequences of slavery and Jim Crow on African Americans. The commission will also make recommendations as to appropriate ways to educate the American public about its findings and appropriate remedies in light of its findings. An honest reckoning with the federal government's role in protecting the institution of slavery has been a leading priority of my congressional career. In 2007, my freshman year, less than 2 months into that term, I introduced H.Res. 194, an apology by the House of Representatives for its role in perpetuating both slavery and its noxious offspring, Jim Crow. The House ultimately passed this resolution by voice vote, and I once again thank Chairman Conyers for getting it a vote and getting it to the American people. As I noted in my resolution then, it was not just slavery itself that was wrong, but also, quote, the visceral racism against persons of African descent upon which, unquote, American slavery depended, a racism that went on to become entrenched in the nation's social fabric, an evil that we must continue to confront today. Can we get that door closed?
Good.
Thank you, sir. My resolution emphasizes that while slavery was our nation's original sin, the underlying sin of anti-black racism did not end with the Civil War and the 13th Amendment, and Congress's inaction and acquiescence in the face of such racism was a big reason why. Racism became only further entrenched after slavery's end, as reflected in societal attitudes and in Jim Crow laws, a system of state racial segregation laws that created separate and unequal societies for whites and African Americans, one that was enforced through both official means and through lynchings, violence, intimidation, and disenfranchisement. And not until 100 years after the end of slavery did Congress, under pressure from Dr. Martin Luther King, John Lewis, and other great civil rights leaders in the civil rights movement, finally carry out its duty to end Jim Crow by passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that still exists to some extent, and other core civil rights statutes, better fulfilling the Constitution's guarantees of equal protection for all. Today, our nation continues to struggle with the legacy of the anti-black racism and undergirded slavery and Jim Crow. We see this in statistics that paint a bleak picture. According to the Census Bureau, 21.2% of African Americans lived in poverty in 2017, compared to 8.7% of non-Hispanic whites who live in poverty. That's over 2 times as many. The Census Bureau also reported in 2015 that the net worth of African American households was only about $13,000, which was less than 10% of the nearly $140,000 net worth of non-Hispanic white households. Limited access to wealth, building resources, and opportunities have led to this stark disparity. For instance, African Americans continue to face discrimination in the workplace. They have limited access to educational opportunities. According to the National Education Association, the high school graduation rate for African Americans was 67% compared to the nationwide average of 81%. African Americans also continue to face racial segregation in housing and discrimination in the availability of quality health care service and most other major facets of life. Enacting H.R. 40 would be an important step in finding effective long-term solutions to these problems, ones that can trace their origins to our nation's shameful history of slavery and anti-black racism. As the distinguished Professor Charles Ogletree of Harvard Law School once noted, the concept of reparations does not necessarily mean payments to individuals, but rather a focus on the poorest of the poor, including efforts, quote, to address comprehensively the problems of those who have not substantially benefited from integration or affirmative action, unquote. I hope our hearing today can lead to fruitful conversations with the aim of achieving that goal. I thank our witnesses for being here today and look forward to their testimony. It is now my pleasure to recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Johnson, for his opening statement.